Racist passenger demands black man be removed, then panics when he reveals his government badge. Catherine Drayton, a seasoned first-class flyer, had always considered the luxury cabin her domain. To her, the plush seats, the attentive service, and the air of exclusivity were not just perks. They were a sign of her success. She was a woman who had worked hard to climb the corporate ladder, and every detail of her life reflected her achievement. First class was where she belonged, and she expected others to recognize that too. To Catherine, the space was more than just a seat on a plane. It was a testament to her wealth, her status, and her entitlement. As she made her way down the aisle, Catherine's eyes scanned the rows of seats. She nodded briefly to the familiar flight attendants and murmured her usual pleasantries. But when she reached her seat, something caught her attention. Sitting in the seat next to hers was a man she hadn't expected to see. Elijah Harris, a black man, appeared to be in his early 40s, with a neatly tailored suit and a composed, almost serene expression. To anyone else, Elijah might have been just another passenger. His calm demeanor, his poised posture, his sharp suit suggesting a man who was well-traveled and successful in his own right. But to Catherine, who had grown accustomed to a very particular type of person in the premium section, Elijah seemed out of place. Her eyes lingered on him longer than they should have. There was something about him that stirred an unease in her, something she couldn't quite put into words. He carried himself with a quiet authority, a self-assurance that seemed to radiate from him without effort. Catherine couldn't help but notice his demeanor, how he sat with his back straight and his hands neatly folded in his lap, as though he were perfectly at ease in his surroundings. To her, however, it wasn't just ease, it was an affront. How could someone like him belong here? This was the domain of executives, business leaders, and the elite, and Catherine had a deeply ingrained belief that not everyone was entitled to the same access. She had flown first class countless times, and she knew the types of people who occupied the seat next to hers. Well-dressed, affluent individuals who could be relied upon to maintain a certain decorum. But Elijah, despite his outward calm, didn't seem to fit into her narrow perception of who belonged in first class. She took her seat beside him, the leather of the chair squeaking slightly as she adjusted herself. Her movements were sharp, quick, and not as graceful as she intended. Elijah glanced at her for a brief moment, his gaze polite but disinterested. Catherine, on the other hand, couldn't seem to look away. Her discomfort was palpable, and she shifted in her seat, glancing around the cabin for a distraction, but finding none. It was as if his very presence made her skin itch. As the plane began its taxi toward the runway, Catherine's fidgeting grew more pronounced. She crossed and uncrossed her legs, tapped her fingers lightly on the armrest, and occasionally glanced at Elijah out of the corner of her eye. He sat still, not noticing her agitation, his attention seemingly elsewhere. Catherine's discomfort began to manifest in more subtle ways. She shifted her bag from her lap to the floor, readjusted her seatbelt, and flicked her hair over her shoulder, trying desperately to maintain some semblance of composure. But nothing worked. She felt increasingly restless, as though the calm she had been accustomed to was being disturbed by something she couldn't control. Elijah remained unmoved, absorbed in his own thoughts, or perhaps simply unbothered by her presence. Catherine's irritation simmered beneath the surface. Unable to quell her unease, she turned to the flight attendant, who was making her way down the aisle, checking on passengers. Catherine leaned slightly to the side, lowering her voice in a tone that was tinged with passive aggression. "Excuse me," she said, her words carefully measured. "I don't know if you can do something about this, but I'm uncomfortable sitting here. Is there any chance I could be moved to another seat?" The flight attendant, a seasoned professional who had seen it all, looked at her with polite curiosity. "Of course, Mrs. Drayton," she replied, recognizing Catherine from previous flights. "Is something wrong with your seat?" Catherine hesitated for just a moment before responding, trying to make her request sound reasonable, though she couldn't quite explain why she felt the way she did. "It's just, I don't feel at ease sitting next to him," she said, nodding toward Elijah. "I don't know. It's hard to explain, but I'd prefer a different seat. I'm sure you can find a way to move me." The flight attendant gave her a neutral expression, not entirely convinced by the vagueness of Catherine's request. "I'm afraid we don't have many available seats at the moment, Mrs. Drayton, but let me check with the crew and see if there's anything we can do." Catherine, clearly unsatisfied with this response, straightened in her seat, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked back at Elijah. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that his very presence was a disruption. The more she tried to rationalize it, the more her irritation grew. Elijah's calmness seemed to mock her discomfort, and she couldn't quite handle the dissonance. She was a person who controlled her environment, who chose where and when she felt at ease. This situation, this unexpected intrusion into her comfort zone, felt wrong. Minutes passed, but her unease only deepened. Catherine crossed her arms over her chest, her lips pressed together tightly. The more she thought about it, the more her mind raced. Why should someone like Elijah be in first class? He wasn't like the other passengers she had encountered, the ones who exuded an aura of privilege and entitlement. He didn't belong here, and that thought gnawed at her. Catherine's mind spun with unspoken assumptions, not even fully aware of the prejudice guiding her discomfort. She just knew that this situation didn't sit well with her, and that, to her, was reason enough to demand a change. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong. She was simply trying to make the flight more comfortable for herself, a reasonable request, considering her status as a loyal first-class passenger. But as the minutes passed and the flight attendants continued their checks, Catherine's frustration grew, and she began to press harder, demanding a solution. What she didn't expect was that her request would lead to a confrontation that would shake her sense of entitlement and challenge everything she believed about her position in the world. As the flight continued its journey through the skies, Catherine's discomfort did not subside. In fact, it only seemed to intensify. She shifted in her seat repeatedly, her agitation bubbling to the surface. Her fingers drummed nervously against the armrest, and her gaze frequently darted over to Elijah, as if his mere presence was a constant distraction she couldn't ignore. The plane was still climbing to cruising altitude, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin, but Catherine's mind was far from peaceful. She couldn't focus on anything else. Her discomfort had grown to a point where it seemed to demand attention, and she felt as if the entire situation was becoming intolerable. Without hesitation, she pressed the call button again, signaling to the flight attendant, who quickly arrived at her seat, her face polite but weary. "Yes, Mrs. Drayton? Is everything okay?" the attendant asked, trying to mask the subtle tension in her voice. Catherine, her face now flushed with irritation, leaned forward slightly. "I'm sorry, but I really can't sit here any longer," she said, her voice barely concealing her annoyance. "I need to be moved. This is completely unacceptable." The flight attendant, sensing the mounting intensity of the request, tried to remain calm. "I understand, Mrs. Drayton, but we are currently at cruising altitude, and I'm afraid there are no other available seats at the moment. Is there something specific about your current seat that's causing you discomfort?" Catherine's lips tightened. She glanced over at Elijah again, this time with a barely contained sneer. "It's not about the seat," she replied curtly. "It's about the person sitting next to me. I don't feel comfortable with him here. Can't you just find another seat for me? Anywhere. Please." The flight attendant hesitated, unsure how to respond to such an open request for segregation. Catherine's words were vague, evasive, but her tone had grown sharper, more insistent. She wasn't offering any reason for her discomfort beyond the fact that Elijah was sitting next to her. There was no mention of any specific action on his part. No aggressive behavior, no disruption. It was simply his presence, something Catherine couldn't or wouldn't explain. "Mrs. Drayton," the flight attendant said slowly, her professionalism holding firm, "I understand that you may not feel at ease, but we do have to respect the seating arrangements. All passengers have paid for their seats, and moving someone at this point would be very difficult. I suggest that you try to relax and enjoy the flight." But Catherine's frustration had reached its peak. She leaned back in her seat, crossed her arms tightly over her chest, and shook her head, her voice rising as she repeated her demand. "I don't care about your arrangements. I don't feel safe sitting next to him. You need to do something about this, now." Her words echoed in the quiet cabin, causing heads to turn. Several passengers, who had been minding their own business, now glanced over, their attention drawn by the elevated tension in the air. Some of them exchanged uncomfortable looks, sensing the underlying tone of Catherine's words. This wasn't about safety. It was about her inability to accept Elijah in the space she felt was exclusively hers. The flight attendant, visibly taken aback by the shift in Catherine's tone, tried to calm the situation. "Mrs. Drayton, I must ask you to remain calm. We're just trying to ensure that all passengers are comfortable. Perhaps you could try to rest or watch a movie. We'll do everything we can to make your flight more pleasant, but moving seats isn't feasible at this point." Catherine's eyes narrowed and her irritation flared. The idea of sitting next to Elijah, the man who so clearly didn't belong in her world, was becoming unbearable. Her voice was louder now, and she wasn't even trying to hide the contempt in her words. "I don't care what's feasible or not. This isn't just a matter of comfort, it's about my safety. I'm telling you, I feel unsafe with him sitting here. His presence is making me uncomfortable, and I'm not going to sit next to him any longer. Get him moved. Or I'll make sure this is reported to someone higher up." The cabin crew, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, exchanged quick glances. They had seen difficult passengers before, but something about Catherine's insistence was different. There was a deep sense of entitlement in her words, something that made this more than just a minor inconvenience. It wasn't about a seat. It was about power, control, and Catherine's unspoken belief that she could dictate the atmosphere in a space she believed was reserved for people like her. Other passengers began to take notice. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others whispered among themselves, exchanging uncomfortable glances. No one dared to speak up yet, but the tension was palpable. A few passengers, sensing that something was wrong, subtly adjusted their posture in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding in front of them. Catherine, now growing increasingly desperate, raised her voice once again, her tone unmistakably demanding. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I am paying for a first-class experience, and this is not the experience I signed up for. I'm not going to sit here, next to him, for the rest of this flight. Either you move him, or I'll have to escalate this." Her words were met with a heavy silence, as the flight attendants took a step back, uncertain of how to proceed. Elijah, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, continued to read his book, unfazed by the scene unfolding beside him. His calmness seemed to exacerbate Catherine's frustration, as if his indifference to the situation only served to highlight the irrationality of her demands. It was at this moment that some of the other passengers, who had been quietly observing the interaction, began to murmur to each other. The whispers grew louder, and some began to share disapproving glances with Catherine. It became clear that many were not on her side. She had crossed a line. What had started as an unreasonable request was now becoming an outright display of discrimination. Catherine's voice faltered slightly as the passengers' murmurs reached her ears, and she realized that her entitlement was no longer going unnoticed. But her frustration was so far gone, she could hardly care. She demanded again that Elijah be moved, this time in a voice laced with thinly veiled hostility. The cabin crew, now caught in the middle, tried to remain diplomatic, but it was clear that they could do little to appease her without creating an even bigger scene. It was only a matter of time before the atmosphere in the cabin would reach its breaking point. Catherine's demands had gone too far, and she had pushed everyone around her into an uncomfortable silence, until someone would finally speak up. Then, as the tension in the cabin reached its peak, something happened that no one had expected. Elijah, who had remained an unflappable figure throughout the entire ordeal, finally decided to address the situation. He had sat through Catherine's increasingly vocal demands with an air of quiet dignity, never once raising his voice, his calmness a stark contrast to her growing hostility. He had given her space, hoping she would settle down, but the moment had arrived when enough was enough. With a slow, deliberate motion, Elijah placed his hand on the armrest between them, almost as if to signal the shift in the air. Without saying a word, he slid his jacket sleeve up just enough to reveal a gleaming metal badge clipped to the inside of his suit. The badge, reflecting the soft cabin light, caught the eye of several nearby passengers, but it wasn't until Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice soft yet firm, that the full impact of the moment hit. "You don't need to worry about safety," he said, his words clear and unwavering. "I'm with the federal government." The words hung in the air like a sudden burst of cold air, freezing everyone in place. Catherine, still in the middle of her rant, froze for a split second, her mouth hanging slightly open as she processed what had just been said. The words were simple, but their weight was enormous. Elijah had just revealed that he was not just any ordinary passenger, but a law enforcement officer with significant authority. His calm demeanor and professionalism immediately made Catherine's rant seem utterly misplaced. For a moment, there was complete silence. The realization hit like a shockwave throughout the cabin. The flight attendants who had been standing nearby suddenly froze as well, unsure how to react to this unexpected turn of events. Catherine's eyes widened in disbelief as she glanced at the badge again, her mind racing to process what had just happened. Her voice faltered as she tried to regain control of the situation, but the air had shifted. It was no longer just about a disagreement over seating. It was about a complete change in power dynamics. Elijah was not someone she could dismiss or accuse without consequence. His identity as a federal agent placed him in a realm that was far beyond her reach. The atmosphere in the cabin, once thick with tension and discomfort, now felt charged with an unspoken understanding. Elijah was not the problem. It was Catherine's behavior that had crossed a line, and everyone in the cabin could sense it. Catherine's gaze flickered nervously as she finally found her voice, but it was no longer as confident as before. I didn't know," she stammered, her usual composure slipping. Her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and frustration, but her attempts to salvage the situation were futile. The damage had already been done, and the passengers around her were beginning to take note of the shift in the room. One by one, the passengers who had been silently observing began to murmur among themselves. Some were shocked, others angry, and a few seemed to offer subtle nods of approval to Elijah, as if acknowledging the quiet dignity with which he had handled the situation. The murmurs grew louder, and Catherine's attempt to maintain control of the narrative became increasingly difficult. Her earlier demand for Elijah to be removed from the seat was now seen through a completely different lens, one that revealed her prejudice more than any action of Elijah's. The flight attendants, now fully aware of what had transpired, began to move toward Elijah, their demeanor shifting from neutral to one of support. They approached him with renewed respect, offering polite reassurances that they would handle any further concerns. They subtly distanced themselves from Catherine's outburst, offering her no more attention than was absolutely necessary. Elijah, ever composed, simply nodded, acknowledging their support without needing to say much more. He knew that the incident had already spiraled out of Catherine's control. Her behavior had left her exposed, and the reaction from the other passengers made it clear that there was no turning back. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin remained thick with a quiet tension, but now it was a collective discomfort with Catherine's conduct rather than with Elijah's presence. Some passengers, unable to stay silent, began to address the situation directly. A woman seated in the row behind Catherine leaned forward and said pointedly, "You know, it's not the man beside you that's making you uncomfortable, it's your attitude." Another passenger, an older man with a calm but firm voice, added, "It's astonishing that in this day and age, we still have people who think they can make others feel unwelcome simply because of their race. Shameful." These comments, though soft, were powerful, and Catherine could feel the weight of each word as they landed. The support for Elijah was palpable, and even those who had initially been quiet now began to speak up, expressing their disapproval of her actions. The air was no longer thick with tension from Elijah's presence, but with a unified sense of disapproval towards her behavior. The flight attendants, too, were beginning to position themselves more closely to Elijah, clearly offering him a level of protection, while subtly disengaging from Catherine. They knew that they could not afford to ignore the growing discomfort that she had sparked within the cabin. Elijah, for his part, remained perfectly poised, not seeking any further attention, but accepting the subtle shifts in the cabin's energy. In that moment, Catherine realized that her attempt to assert dominance and control had backfired in a way she had never imagined. Elijah had not only remained calm throughout the entire ordeal, but he had also quietly, without raising his voice or making a scene, put her in her place. His simple revelation had transformed the atmosphere of the cabin from one of uncertainty to one of collective condemnation of her actions. Catherine sat in stunned silence as the cabin continued to shift around her. She had tried to target Elijah, to make him feel out of place in a world she thought she controlled. But in doing so, she had revealed her own insecurities and prejudices to a room full of strangers who were no longer willing to let her get away with it. As the plane touched down and the passengers disembarked, Catherine's world began to unravel in ways she couldn't have anticipated. The incident, which had felt like a contained conflict on the flight, quickly spread far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Within minutes of stepping off the plane, someone, an anonymous passenger who had been quietly observing the confrontation, had posted a video of the altercation on social media. The video, shaky at times, but still clear enough to capture the heated exchange between Catherine and Elijah, went viral almost instantly. It showed Catherine's increasingly hostile demands to have Elijah removed from his seat, her vague and unsubstantiated claims of feeling unsafe, and her growing frustration as the flight attendants and surrounding passengers became uncomfortable with her behavior. The final blow, the moment Elijah calmly revealed his federal agent badge, was the climax of the video. His composed, dignified handling of the situation contrasted sharply with Catherine's erratic, racially charged demands. Within hours, the video had been shared thousands of times, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Online commentators flooded the post with condemnations of Catherine's actions, calling her out for her blatant prejudice and entitlement. Many praised Elijah for his calm demeanor and his ability to maintain control in the face of such disrespect. The video quickly gained traction on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, with hashtags like Justice for Elijah and Racist in First Class trending worldwide. People were appalled by Catherine's behavior and shocked by her assumption that she had the right to dictate who belonged in first class. News outlets, always eager for a viral story, picked up the video almost as quickly as the social media platforms had. The headline, "Racist Passenger Tries to Have Black Man Removed from First Class, It Doesn't End Well," ran on every major news site, alongside articles detailing the full incident. Journalists pored over the footage, analyzing every moment. The internet, already in an uproar, had a new obsession: Catherine Drayton. Within a matter of hours, Catherine's name was everywhere, but not in the way she had hoped. Her once spotless reputation began to fracture as people dug into her background. Articles from her past began to resurface. Interviews, business dealings, even old social media posts, and many of them, once thought of as neutral or harmless, now painted her in a new, damning light. People found her public statements about inclusivity and diversity, which now seemed hollow in the face of her behavior on the flight. Her social media accounts, once polished and professional, became a target for scorn and criticism. Her colleagues, friends, and clients who had once admired her for her professional success now began to distance themselves. Some publicly denounced her, calling her behavior unacceptable and shameful. Others privately cut ties, unsure of how to navigate the growing controversy. The company, where she had long been a senior partner, issued a statement condemning her actions, saying they did not condone discrimination of any kind, and that they were reviewing their association with her. But the worst was yet to come. The charity board, where Catherine had served for over a decade, a position she had prided herself on, announced that they were severing ties with her. The chairperson of the board, in a brief but pointed press release, called Catherine's actions antithetical to the values of inclusion and respect that our organization stands for. This was a devastating blow, as Catherine had built much of her personal brand on her work with charitable organizations. Now, not only was her reputation in tatters, but her professional standing seemed to be crumbling beneath her. As the day wore on, the consequences of her behavior became clearer. More and more companies and organizations publicly distanced themselves from her, including those that had once viewed her as an asset. The luxury brands she had worked with for years quietly removed her from their marketing campaigns. Even the country club she frequented announced that they would be re-evaluating her membership. The fallout was swift, and it wasn't just professional, it was personal. Catherine began to lose friends, with several acquaintances publicly stating that they were disappointed by her behavior. Others privately expressed their shock, some choosing to simply distance themselves without explanation. Her name, once associated with success, prestige, and charitable work, was now linked to racism and entitlement. Public figures, from politicians to activists, weighed in, with many calling for further action to be taken against her. Some even went as far as suggesting she should face a formal investigation into her conduct. While some tried to defend her, claiming that her actions were out of character, the vast majority of people rallied around Elijah, celebrating his professionalism and condemning Catherine's behavior. Catherine tried to control the narrative, but it was clear that the damage was already done. She issued a series of public apologies, each one more disingenuous than the last. At first, she apologized for any misunderstanding and expressed regret that people had been offended. But as the backlash intensified, her apologies became more forced, acknowledging that her behavior was inappropriate without fully taking responsibility for the prejudice at the core of her actions. But no apology could undo the damage. The public had made up its mind. The more she tried to explain herself, the deeper her reputation sunk. She was accused of trying to downplay the severity of her actions, and it only fueled the fire of online criticism. People began to question how someone with her level of privilege and success could be so blind to their own biases. Her public and professional life seemed to collapse in on itself, and Catherine, once untouchable in her world of wealth and influence, was now an outcast. The person who had once been celebrated for her accomplishments was now reduced to the subject of a viral video, an example of entitlement gone unchecked. The shame was unbearable, and Catherine could no longer deny the consequences of her actions. As the days passed, the media continued to run with the story, and more people shared their own experiences of discrimination, encouraged by the attention Catherine's incident had brought to the issue. Elijah, on the other hand, remained largely silent, content to let the fallout play out in his favor. He had never sought the spotlight. His actions had spoken louder than any words he could have said. For Catherine, the once pristine image she had carefully curated over the years was now irrevocably shattered, a victim of her own prejudices and the internet's unforgiving glare. Her career, her relationships, and her reputation were all in ruins, and she had no one but herself to blame.